There was that realization that a lot of companies had, that we should do something. We should have some sort of dialogue. Whatever tool we have, wherever we are, we should use some time to focus on this.
So today we're talking with Candice Morgan. Candice is the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Partner at GV, formerly known as Google Ventures. And in that role, she leads inclusive strategies for GV and its portfolio companies and helps the firm expand diversity across the entrepreneurs that it funds.
Thanks for joining us, Candice.
Yeah, happy to be here.
We always start big picture, and I'd like to start with a question about young companies in the venture space. Obviously, there's a ton of discussion about diversity in teams. Are there things that are sort of like top of mind in the venture space right now when it comes to diversity of teams?
Yes, I think it depends on the size of the company. And at GV, we are stage agnostic, we are sector agnostic, we focus across life sciences and enterprise, consumer tech, frontier tech. So we have a really broad range of companies that we're looking at. And particularly for high growth, small organizations, they're thinking about putting their team together. You know, they're still in rapid growth. They're dealing with, of course, 2020 and all the things that brings. And then they're still deciding whether to even bring in an individual to address diversity. I typically advise that when a company is really small, when we're sub 200 people or so, it's probably too soon to bring in a person in that role. Now, that there are exceptions, but what you don't want is to essentially outsource the work of DEI, especially when you're that small. And so they're often thinking about, how do we build the right council structure, the accountability structure, which is always something you need to think about even as the company grows. One thing I will say, though, that in the venture space or outside of it, companies are dealing with on this topic is both being now distributed and remote, if they weren't before, certainly dealing with that. And then the events of May and June, that Memorial Day weekend. So yeah, certainly, regardless of where you are, what sector you're in, everyone is reckoning with coming out of Memorial Day weekend, coming out of the weekend of protests, and seeing this still or this video of this police officer with this knee upon this man's neck. And that has completely changed a lot of the dynamics of conversations, the things that you talk about explicitly at work, talking about systemic racism, talking about the law enforcement system. And so that's something that companies are grappling with as well. Is, where do we start? If we started, what do we do next?
I wanted to follow up a bit on that portion of your original answer about sort of the, obviously the murder of George Floyd being this real flashpoint in 2020, and then, kind of the summer of all of these protests, the way that sort of changed the national conversation, and certainly, in companies, also in higher ed, right? We, started having a very different conversation at Harvard Business School. So would love to, and you've talked about this a bit already, but would love to hear you talk a little bit about, when you say things have changed, to hear you talk a little bit more about what is the nature of that change. And then I am really interested also in what's your view about what might the long-term impact be? I know you can't predict the future, but what's your sense of where we might go from here?
Yes. Okay. So first, what changed was immediately the conversation. So I'll give GV as an example. We have a monthly conversation where we talk about inclusion, belonging, culture, and we had a meeting planned later that week, just as on the calendar. And then that weekend happened, and George Floyd's murder, and people were negotiating individually how they were responding to that news. And depending on where you sit, there was everyone from, hey, there's a lot of looting going on, and focusing on property. And then there were people like, okay, this is my first ever protest. How do I organize, right? So these very personal conversations people were having at home over the weekend. The first thing people needed to do, and I think most people realized, was this isn't a conversation we completely leave at the door when you come to work on Monday. This is something that is shaping, how people got up that morning. This is a global conversation, and we should do something. So there was that realization that a lot of companies had, that we should do something. We should have some sort of dialogue. Whatever tool we have, wherever we are, we should use some time to focus on this. And I think that that's different. That's different from a lot of issues that are considered political, and that some people feel that you can just kind of check at the door. That says a lot probably about how I feel about some of these issues. Second, then how do you actually conduct that conversation? And so at GB, we had a conversation where we defined systemic racism, and we talked about centering that conversation and how it's connected to many other forms of social or systemic oppression in particular. But we wanted to talk specifically about systemic racism and the many different institutions in which it shows up. So another thing companies had to deal with besides these internal conversations was, what do we say to the world? Because, we started to see the statements on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn, the Black squares and the donations. And honestly, I mean, I'd never, seen leaders so confused over how to proceed. But certainly if we looked at the masses of individuals and companies and leaders making these statements, there was a pressure that even if people were going to say, we're going to keep this conversation internal, they felt, at least, and they talked about it. And there were ways that was done in a kind of, here's our statement, we're going to put it out there, and there we go, we've done it. There were statements with donations to organizations doing some of this work, doing social justice work. And then there were people who were putting out their plans, their anti-racism plans, et cetera. So we saw this whole range of reactions and some hand-wringing behind the scenes over how to handle that. And then finally, people hit this kind of fork where they were like, all right, are we going to carry this forward? Are we going to, is this going to be a cameo by our leadership team, or are we going to lean in and do some work? And if we do lean in and do some work, what does that look like? And that's ultimately where I essentially did a series of conversations with a number of our portfolio companies around what you do now, and wrote an article about this, and posted about it, or talked about it. How do you create that long-term accountability structure from the executive level across the company to create strategic pillars for a multi-year diversity strategy?
Long-term is something that businesses haven't dealt with in this space. Long-term focus on equity is not something, I mean, long-term focus on a lot of things is difficult for businesses, but that's a very different experience based on who you are. Mm-hmm. And I think that's obviously in the US, at least, leadership at companies is not very representative of what the country is as a whole. So this, in some ways, is kind of new for leadership to decide whether they're going, what does long-term look like? What does investing long-term look like? And I mean, it's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work. And I think, in some cases, leadership teams, particularly CEOs, co-founders, et cetera, had to make this decision. Are we going to lean in directly? Are we going to give more time than we had been prior to this? Are we going to tell our HR leader or our diversity leader, like, listen, you better come up with a plan? Are we going to bring this to the board? Is this going to go to the board level? Is this going to stay local? And we've seen across the spectrum on how people have handled that. I will be honest, because, there was another part, Colleen, to your question around, what do we think the long-term impact of this is? I don't know. I think it provided a lot of momentum, but there seems to be, if we were to follow media coverage, for example, that started to die down even before a lot of the global protests stopped or slowed down significantly. Knowing the very divisive political situation in the US and also in other parts of the world, that started to take precedence in the media, as if these conversations aren't connected. They very, very much are. And so I personally felt a sense of, like, I felt almost this countdown clock where I was like, okay, all of these initiatives, all of these plans, not only at GB, but also internally. I was asked to consult externally quite a bit with different institutions across different sectors. And I felt this sense of both responsibility. I felt, I had more support, kind of than ever. I wasn't sure how long that was going to last, and I'm still not sure how long that bump is going to sustain itself.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that's from what I kind of hear from my own network, right? There is this sense that it's like, well, we have this window. We don't really know how long it's going to last. And so that it's an interesting space to be in. And that's kind of a follow up to that. So, right, we can't predict the future. We don't know really what the long-term impact, the more, systemic impact will be of these conversations and of this kind of, new urgency and renewed attention. But would love to hear you talk a little bit about, say the long-term impact is really to create change and is to actually genuinely establish, a greater degree of equity and inclusion in the workplace, particularly in tech. Like, can you talk a little bit about what that would look like? Sort of what does that mean?
Yes. So I'm going to say three things. The first is going to be something you just alluded to, which is the composition of leadership. Throughout my career, when I was at Catalyst as a consultant, working with dozens of kind of Fortune 1000 companies, through to working at Pinterest, through to working at GB, now working both internally for GB and across our portfolio companies, pretty much wherever you look, you see this underrepresentation in leadership. And you can, define what that underrepresentation means by industry, by the company, by the talent pool, but there is underrepresentation. And I think that even companies that have done well on diversity leadership have still struggled when it comes to, senior leadership representation and board representation, even having these conversations at the board level. And part of the reason I've found for that, in my own experience, has been, well, there's a combination of things. There's kind of like, okay, well, what does that conversation look like at the board level? Because the accountability wasn't necessarily coming from the board. So the leadership team was kind of like, well, what do we mean? Like, how do we shape that? When you're doing these very specialized senior hires, even if you have some sort of diversity slate rule, Rooney rule, or some modification of it, you see the exceptions start coming in at these very, senior roles. Oh, you know what? This is super mission critical. People start to get nervous. They pattern match more. And even if they say, if a senior manager wants to hire, they've got to meet this diversity slate, somehow at that senior layer, exceptions happen. And you have a few shots because you only have a few openings. So those exceptions reverberate. Another thing that I would say I see happening is not enough of the diversity investment happening on the product side or the client side, the services side, B2B side. It's a lot of internal talent discussions, but it's not necessarily, if every conversation you're having about the business is, kind of rooted in, we want to make the world, or we want to make this process easier for our customers. But then you have this diversity conversation and it's just about, hiring and talent, or, most places are also talking about inclusion and belonging, which is excellent. Some organizations are talking about equity, right? So how do you create these experiences where anyone can succeed? So you see this continuum, but if you can't link that and carry that through to your product, then the conversation people won't connect the dots, and they will relegate it to like, this is an HR people thing. So that's another area. And then kind of another variable we've talked about is like how much senior leadership involvement, how much is everyone's responsibility, how much is built into reward systems versus like, hey, we'll do a manager meeting every couple of months or every once a year on this, but otherwise, again, it's an HR people thing. So I think what this would look like to answer the question is, we would see that diverse representation in leadership, and we would see leadership that looks something like the customers or the end users, of a product. We would see innovation around inclusive AI, inclusive products. I mean, I've even, consulted on consumer products and, skin tone and thinking about, the vocabulary, the marketing, all of that, the creators that you use. Holistically, we would see that prioritized across the leadership team globally for companies.
Yeah, that's really well put. I mean, I think what you're saying, right, is it just becomes core to the business, right? Instead of, as you said, kind of over here, this HR thing. And I think it's about, it is about changing people's approach. I mean, just such a great example, like you said, of you can have these processes like a Rooney rule or whatever. That's great. But then if those can easily, right, be sort of overridden or not adhered to by the people in power, how effective are they going to be? So I think those are really, really great points.
I'm actually struck, yes, this is really important that the work be core. But I'm starting to wonder, and you have a lot of experience in business now and working with businesses. Is that something that American businesses struggle with, making things core? I mean, there's this history of like these segments and groups in HR and marketing, and it strikes me that even with technology, making technology core is difficult. Companies are like, oh, there's an IT department. Like, I don't have to think about tech because I'm in marketing. Oh, oops, I forgot. Like, I realized that. So
That's why
is there something more, is there something more systemic even about companies or US business that has struggled making things core unless it's part of the built-in values and, as you said, the leadership and how they contribute?
That's a good question. I think it's less specific to American businesses or companies. I'm kind of obsessed and fascinated by, cross-cultural conversations around management and inclusion. My master's work was in cross-cultural psychology and management. And I just think that in general, humans are kind of slow to adapt and change. And there is pain involved, right, to making these changes. So we kind of fall back on our patterns when things get hard until we're forced to do things differently. Let's take the example of a distributed workforce or working remotely. A lot of organizations still, right up till March 10th or 15th or whenever one's date was that you became remote, just simply didn't believe in having a very distributed workforce and assumed that would lead to a profound, loss in productivity. And yes, there are definitely trade-offs with us not being in the office. Don't get me wrong, but the fact that there has been business continuity, and it really depends on who you're talking to and where they sit. But we haven't seen the complete collapse of the global economy. Is because actually, like, doing things different requires all these pattern changes, but sometimes can be done, right?
What advice do you have for getting unstuck, especially around a product or your service?
Yeah, I'll give a concrete example. So when I was at Pinterest, and I was a Pinterest user, like many users, I go through my cycles of, my on-ramp was a friend's wedding, and so got obsessed, kind of put it on the back burner for a bit, changed jobs, got a new wardrobe, so I had these cyclical, times when I got like really, really into it, and it brought me joy. However, as a Black woman, as a woman of color, when I was searching for beauty tips, particularly hair tips, right? That, like, one of my biggest boards is called "Don't Touch the Hair." I learned how to search and make the product work for me, but there were some extra steps that I had to take to find things that were relevant to me. And even I took that for granted in some ways. Like, if anything, it was inconvenient, but I learned how to just make it work. And then there I was, status quo. And what changed, I mean, for me personally, was were a few things. Starting to get feedback from users, other women of color who had the same experience, were frustrated by it, realizing that, with folks spending more time online and that shaping their self-image and their worldview as things do. I mean, whether you're online or not, you are getting these messages from marketing and from, beauty magazines, et cetera. But you're trying to create this idea of what your life is going to look like, and you're constructing that in these boards. And so I remember going to the product team and approaching the then kind of someone on the machine, on the computer vision side, and someone on the product side, and with some specific user queries that just didn't work as well for users of color, users with deeper skin tones. And the way it was initially approached was a little like, okay, we need to solve that query versus we need to revamp this ecosystem. I remember say about a year ago at this time, officially created a full-on product team, several engineers, several designers, and begin an initiative around creators. And now, when you go on the platform, not only is there more representation in search and ads, but this feature that we created where you could customize search by skin tone, the recall on it is better than I've ever seen it, right? So that was like 4 years though. That was a slow, like 3.5, 4 year process of kind of dipping the toe, crystallizing how this intersected with the core business need that the founder had envisioned in the first place, realizing customers wanted this, doing all kinds of research experiments, and then realizing that the effort exceeded and the rewards for that exceeded the pain of making a change.
I especially find it interesting how you said, even you who's aware of this space sort of put up with it.
Mm-hmm.
What does that cost? What's the cost to you personally? What's the cost to people to have to interface with technologies where they actually have to put in effort?
Wow, it's one of these costs that, is often subconscious. And we learn a lot about it from the amazing strides that have been made in accessibility work, right? So, which still anyone who's doing accessibility work continues to advocate and struggle to mainstream, technology that is inclusive if you have low vision, if you are hard of hearing, et cetera, right? So there's still this very slow crawl towards creating technology that then benefits everyone because it makes, takes a user issue and makes it more obsolete. But I don't think I realized it consciously until, I experienced and heard from people. And it wasn't a lot of people. I mean, most people had just kind of figured out and navigated their way. But when they talked about how their self-image and the vision board that they wanted to create were intertwined, I think realizing that power and the potential damage of not doing this became really strong. And so when we were, in that role, when we were going through different iterations of what this feature could look like, and the fact that we needed to even create a feature, then we started all asking these questions of like, wait a minute, so what have people been doing? You show this example of like how people were trying to get around these algorithms and their assumptions. And you realize, wow, once it becomes conscious, I think is when it feels the most costly. But the idea that something wasn't made for you, right, is awful.
So this is, this is a good point, right? Is that once you can get the people with the capabilities focused on the right topics, it's not difficult. They need the motivation to do it.
Yes, and they can get creative. Like, the whole computer vision team, like it was just amazing what they can do.
So I wanted to ask Candice, and you mentioned this, a little bit already, kind of your career journey, right? So you were at Catalyst for a number of years, which Catalyst has been around for decades, right? It's like kind of the premier think tank and consulting firm around gender equality in particular in the workplace. Although I think they have a pretty strong intersectional lens, but that's kind of their bread and butter. And they work, I understand, with a lot of large companies, right? Fortune 500 companies, these large, been around for a long time, publicly listed companies. You went from there to Pinterest, right, to this high growth startup in tech, and now obviously have moved on to a venture, working with now again a range of companies, but probably in a different space in a lot of ways, and a lot of different types of companies. So I'm just curious to hear, as you kind of think about your own journey, like, are there things that you found are very consistent, and as you think about how to push forward for diversity and inclusion and equity, across all of those different kinds of organizations, what's different, or just kind of your reflections about that?
Yes, absolutely. All such very different environments. And so I would say at Catalyst, first of all, just the dynamic nature of working with so many different companies, but a lot of them being very large, multinational, Fortune 500 companies. The cultures were definitely different. It's definitely more a traditional corporate culture, especially when I was working in a professional services firm environment. However, going over to tech in 2015, 2016, the diversity conversation was so new. And I found that so baffling, knowing that, IBM had its first ERG in like the late 70s, and suddenly tech was like, there's this diversity thing. And I think a lot of, 2014 was kind of that big moment, especially when a lot of the data started to come out and the conversation became more central in tech. And also the tendency for that high growth tech not to want to look backwards, but to very much want to innovate forward, was just super interesting to me, because there was so much to be learned from companies that had been working on this in some cases for a couple of decades already. I think, though, that a similarity across both of those, and I see this in venture somewhat as well, is the point at which companies got stuck. So this, there was more governance. There tended to be more people in longer tenured diversity roles, people who came from different sectors in Fortune 500 companies, as opposed to tech, where you had people who were pretty short tenured. You had people who, you had this probably 30% of people that were in diversity leadership roles who had just been in other roles at companies, but very passionate, that moved into diversity roles as their primary role and were amazing at it. I mean, in all kinds of different respects. But the formula of, inclusion equals ERGs and employee survey results and some diagnostic workforce data, and then hiring. And there we are, right? Versus moving into both equity and moving this conversation into the core of the business, and more broadly making the responsibility of the business, right? That point tended to be a jam, no matter where you sit. And in venture, there is just, I'm going to be honest, I would say overall just less accountability for diversity. And I will say certainly less so before, as we talked about George Floyd's murder, and as we've talked about this reckoning and this uprising that we've seen from people and from employees internally to say, this isn't good enough that you put out that statement and never followed up, right? But I would say, spring of 2020, the accountability that we started to see in tech in 2014, 2015 did not extend to venture. Now we are seeing in venture, particularly the funding model, and the fact that the funding model and how you make connections to get funded are so network driven, and that the networks are just very insular. That has become a point of conversation now that I hope leads to more than just conversation. We are seeing a lot of coalitions. We're seeing groups to get together. I'm having several conversations with other firms or with kind of cross-sector organizations, indexes, metrics, accountability, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm seeing something that could be promising, but I still just don't see the same level of accountability yet. And I don't know if that traction will stick. So yeah.
No, that actually was great. And I mean, I'm really interested. I mean, it's interesting to hear what you're saying about how the conversation does seem to be evolving in venture. And I'm just so curious to see, where that goes personally. But so, the other way to ask this question is less about sort of, you talking about your journey and what you've learned over the years, but, asking you just about, this is a relatively new role for you, right? At GV, you started maybe a year ago, is something like that?
Yeah.
And so, just would love to hear you talk a little bit about what motivated you, right, to move into this space, and, what are your goals? What do you hope to accomplish in this particular space, as opposed to, the past work that you've done? What's different about it? What are you excited about?
Yes. So leading equity, diversity, and inclusion in venture is super unusual. So the firm didn't really have a model on which to build this role. There is no, counterpart that I could, go kind of just like pick their brain and download and then say, what do I do now? Although there are several individuals who either have specialist roles on culture, who have really, made inclusion a central part of their purview. And there are some corporate venture capital funds that are starting to create more roles like this, or at least beginning to experiment with a portion of people's roles being dedicated to it. But as a full-time role, it's pretty new. And that's both exciting and a bit, a bit intimidating. I would say what motivated me to take the role, well, really there were a couple of things that motivated me. One was I wanted to continue the work that I was doing. I'm so devoted to this equity work, but I wanted to figure out how to continue to do this work at scale in a meaningful way. And if we think about one of the biggest challenges in terms of systemic racism and systemic bias, it's the wealth gap. I remember actually back when I was at Catalyst, one of the researchers, Dr. Kathy Giscombe, had led a session about the wealth gap that was amazing, informative, and frankly, terribly depressing. And nobody forgot it. And so, when you think about the amount of capital that flows through venture and private equity, and if you continue to extend and think about how people get funded and raise capital, it is such an important point at which, as I said to Ben at Pinterest, and as I've said to others, how do we build the next great company that happens to have an underrepresented woman at the helm, for example, and that has this leadership team that is representative and diverse, as we've talked about. And so that was intriguing to me. I'd just never seen a role like this before. And I should probably mention that the other thing that I found very intriguing was that the role itself is equally distributed across 3 different functions. So part of my role is advising the portfolio, which is akin to my Catalyst work. Part of the role is leading equity, diversity, inclusion for GV, which is akin to some extent to my Pinterest work. And then this third portion of the role, which is something I've never done before, which is around working with the investing team in particular on diversifying the founders that they are meeting, the way that they are thinking about funding, their personal networks, just super, super intriguing, powerful, and has the potential to make a great impact.
So for somebody who's watching, who is interested in these issues, is maybe aspiring to kind of make a difference in the tech sector the way you have, what are things that you would recommend that they read or watch or think about, people whose work they should get to know? What kind of advice would you give?
In terms of the tech sector and understanding some of the data around, basically what's up with this pipeline thing? Is it a pipeline problem? Where do you start to see people drop out of the workforce, particularly people from underrepresented backgrounds in tech leadership and in the founder population? The Kapor Center has this wonderful site. It's called the Leaky Pipeline. And you can basically explore across the student to tech pipeline where you start to see people drop out of the workforce, everything from retention, what starts to influence, people's success, or in other circumstances, people's kind of leaving the tech workforce. So the Leaky Tech Pipeline is another thing that I recommend. There are wonderful organizations for technologists of color. One organization that I recommend is called Dev Color. And they are particularly an organization for Black software engineers. It was actually founded by a former Pinterest engineer who I had the pleasure of working with on my team for just a few months before he founded the organization. So those are a few tools that I would give. In terms of books, I think there have been so many books that have been recommended that I am almost loath to add to the list. But a few that we distributed to our company at GB was So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo. I just think it's such an accessible book to understand people's daily experiences. And then finally, I'd point to Bias by Jennifer Eberhardt, because even if you tend to feel that a lot of these conversations or a lot of the vocabulary just kind of escapes you, the facts are there in that book that there are different outcomes based on our immediate subconscious perceptions of individuals.
Candice, thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Yeah, thank you. This has been a really fascinating conversation.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
That's a wrap on the interview, but the conversation continues.
And we want to hear from you. Send us your questions, comments, and ideas to justdigital.hbs.edu.
You've been watching Pathways to a Just Digital Future,
an investigative project that aims to better understand and address inequality in tech.
This program was produced by the Harvard Business School Digital and Gender Initiatives.
Our team includes
Ethiopia Almaty and my cat.
Tanya Flint.
One more time. Liz Sarli.
Thomas Jamie da yo.
I'm Dave Homa.
And I'm Colleen Ammerman.
Thanks for hanging out with us.
Keep exploring at justdigital.hbs.edu.